The hot Tennessee sun was finally setting as Staff Sergeant David Williams pulled his old pickup truck into the gravel parking lot of Murphy's Tavern. After 18 long months in Afghanistan, he was finally home on leave. The familiar sounds of crickets and distant highway traffic felt like music to his ears after so many nights of listening for incoming mortars and enemy movement. David sat in his truck for a moment, just breathing. Everything felt different now. The simple act of driving to a bar without checking for roadside bombs, of walking into a building without scanning for threats, of ordering a beer without wondering if it might be his last. These were luxuries he'd almost forgotten existed. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. 28 years old, but his eyes looked older. The deployment had changed him in ways he was still figuring out. His sister Jenny had noticed it when he'd arrived home 3 days ago. She'd hugged him tight and whispered, "Welcome home, brother." But he could see the concern in her eyes. She kept asking if he was okay, if he needed to talk to someone. David appreciated her worry, but right now all he wanted was to feel normal again. The tavern looked exactly like what he'd expected from Jenny's description. A simple wooden building, with neon beer signs glowing in the windows, motorcycles and pickup trucks scattered across the parking lot. This was small-town America at its most authentic. No pretense, no fancy decorations, just honest working folks having a drink after a long day. David had grown up about 50 miles south of here, but he'd never been to Murphy's before. Jenny had mentioned it was a decent place to grab a cold beer and some peace and quiet. That's all he wanted right now. Just a corner table, a cold drink, and maybe an hour or two where he didn't have to think about anything more complicated than what song to play on the jukebox. He stepped out of his truck and immediately felt the humid Tennessee air wrap around him like a warm blanket. Even the heat felt good after the dry, choking dust of Afghanistan. David had dressed simply tonight. Worn jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and his favorite baseball cap. No uniform, no rank insignia, nothing to draw attention. He wanted to blend in, to feel like a regular guy for once. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, and immediately he was hit with the familiar smell of beer, fried food, and old wood. The interior was dimly lit, with overhead fans slowly turning to move the thick air around. A handful of people sat scattered throughout the room, some at the bar, others at small tables. Country music played softly from an old jukebox in the corner, mixing with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glass bottles. David made his way to the bar where an older man with gray hair and a friendly face was wiping down glasses. The bartender looked up and nodded. "What can I get you?" "Just a beer, please, whatever you've got on tap." "Coming right up." The bartender pulled a cold mug from the cooler and filled it with golden beer, sliding it across the polished wood surface. "Haven't seen you around here before." "Just passing through," David replied, taking his first sip. The beer was ice cold and perfect. "Friend of mine recommended this place." "Well, she's got good taste. This is a good spot for folks who just want to relax." The bartender smiled and moved on to help another customer. David took his beer and found a small table in the corner, away from the main flow of traffic. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through text messages from Jenny, his parents, and a few army buddies who were also on leave. Jenny was asking about dinner plans for the weekend. His mom wanted to know if he needed anything from the store. His dad had sent a simple message, "Proud of you, son." The messages made him smile, but they also reminded him of how hard it was going to be to readjust. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to show him how much they'd missed him. But nobody really understood what he'd been through. How could they? They'd been living their normal lives while he'd been in a war zone. The gap between their experiences felt huge sometimes. David put his phone away and just sat for a while, watching the other people in the bar. There was an older couple sharing a basket of wings, talking quietly and laughing occasionally. A group of construction workers still in their work clothes were playing pool, good-naturedly arguing about who owed who drinks. At the bar, a woman about his age was having what looked like a serious conversation with the bartender about something. This was what normal looked like. This was what he'd been fighting to protect. Regular people living their lives, feeling safe enough to relax and enjoy themselves. It should have made him feel good, but instead, it made him feel strangely disconnected. like he was watching life through a window instead of actually living it. He thought about his unit, the guys he'd left behind who were still deployed. Right now, they were probably settling in for another night in the desert, checking their gear, making sure their weapons were clean and ready. Some of them wouldn't make it home. That thought hit him hard every time. The randomness of who lived and who died, who got to come home and who didn't. David shook his head and took another drink. This was exactly the kind of thinking he was trying to avoid tonight. Jenny had been right to suggest he get out of the house for a while. Sitting alone in his childhood bedroom for 3 days straight hadn't been helping anyone. The jukebox finished one song and started another, something by an old country singer about coming home. The irony wasn't lost on him. David looked around the room again, trying to focus on the present moment, trying to feel grateful for the simple pleasure of drinking a cold beer in a safe place. He noticed a group of men in leather jackets sitting at a table across the room. They looked like they belonged to some kind of motorcycle club, with patches on their jackets and bandanas around their necks. They seemed to be having a good time, talking loudly and laughing at their own jokes. One of them, a big guy with a thick beard, kept glancing over in David's direction. David didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the guy was just curious about a new face in their regular hangout spot. But as the minutes passed, he noticed more of them looking his way. Their conversation seemed to be getting more intense, and their body language was changing from relaxed to something else entirely. The beer didn't taste as good anymore. David's military training was automatically kicking in, the part of his brain that had kept him alive overseas. He found himself noting exit routes, counting potential threats, calculating distances. It was frustrating how quickly his mind went back to that mode, but he couldn't help it. He finished his beer and was considering whether to order another, or just call it a night when he saw the big bearded man stand up from his table. The man said something to his friends, and they all turned to look directly at David. Their expressions weren't friendly. David's heart rate increased slightly, but he kept his face calm. Maybe they were just drunk and looking for some entertainment. Maybe it was nothing. But his instincts, honed by months of staying alert in dangerous situations, were telling him otherwise. His peaceful evening was about to become something very different. The big man with the beard started walking toward David's table, and immediately the atmosphere in the bar changed. Conversations grew quieter, and David could feel other people stealing glances in their direction. The man moved with the swagger of someone who was used to intimidating people, his leather jacket creaking with each step. David kept his hands relaxed on the table, but every muscle in his body was ready. In Afghanistan, this kind of situation could mean the difference between life and death. Here in a Tennessee bar, it probably just meant trouble, but his body didn't know the difference. His training had taught him to stay calm, assess the threat, and be ready for anything. The bearded man reached David's table and stood there for a moment looking down at him. Up close, David could see the patches on his jacket, something about iron wolves and various other symbols that suggested this was more than just a casual motorcycle group. The man's arms were covered in tattoos, and his presence filled the small space around the table. "Well, well," the man said loudly, making sure everyone in the bar could hear him. "What do we have here?" His voice carried a tone that David recognized, the kind of artificial friendliness that was really a threat in disguise. David looked up calmly. "Just having a beer." He kept his voice level and non-confrontational. Sometimes that was enough to diffuse a situation before it started. "Just having a beer," the man repeated, like he was testing the words. "That's funny, because I don't remember seeing you around here before, and I know pretty much everyone who comes to Murphy's." He pulled out the chair across from David without being invited and sat down heavily. The bartender, Tom, was watching nervously from behind the bar. David could see him weighing whether to intervene or stay out of it. The other customers were trying to pretend they weren't paying attention, but the tension in the room was obvious. "I'm just passing through," David said. "Don't want any trouble." The bearded man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" He leaned forward, putting his elbows on the table. "I'm just being friendly. Name's Jake, by the way, Jake Patterson." "And you are?" "David." "David what?" David hesitated for a moment. In the military, you learned when to give information and when to keep it to yourself. This felt like one of those times. Oh, be careful. Just David. Jake's smile disappeared. Just David, huh? You know, David, I've been coming to this bar for about 15 years. My daddy came here before me and his daddy before him. It's what you might call a family tradition. He gestured around the room. Most of the folks here, they're what you'd call locals. Born and raised. Part of the community. David could see where this was heading, and he didn't like it. Jake's voice was getting louder, and his friends at the other table were starting to pay closer attention. A couple of them had stood up and were casually moving closer. Now, I'm not saying strangers aren't welcome, Jake continued. But when strangers come into our place, we like to know a little bit about them. We like to know what brings them here, what their business is. His eyes narrowed, especially strangers who, well, let's just say who might not fit in with the usual crowd. The racial undertone in Jake's words was becoming clearer, and David felt his jaw tighten. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before, unfortunately. Growing up in the South, serving in the military, racism wasn't new to him. But after what he'd been through overseas, after fighting for his country and watching good soldiers of every color bleed and die for the same flag, it hit him differently now. I'm just here for a drink, David repeated. I'll finish it and be on my way. Oh, but that's not very social, Jake said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. Here I am trying to be friendly, trying to get to know you, and you're acting all standoffish. That's not very neighborly. Two of Jake's friends had positioned themselves near David's table now, effectively blocking his path to the door. They weren't being obvious about it, but David's trained eye caught the tactical positioning immediately. They'd done this before. The bartender finally spoke up. Hey, Jake, maybe we should just let the man enjoy his beer in peace. Jake turned toward the bar, his voice getting sharper. Tom, I appreciate your concern, but I think we can handle this ourselves. Besides, David here doesn't mind a little conversation, do you, David? David realized that staying quiet wasn't going to make this go away. These men were looking for a confrontation, and they weren't going to be satisfied until they got one. He'd seen this dynamic before, a group of bullies feeding off each other's energy, escalating a situation because they thought they had the upper hand. Actually, I do mind, David said quietly. I came here to relax, not to be interrogated. Jake's face darkened. Interrogated? That's a big word. You some kind of college boy, David? He looked back at his friends. Boys, we got ourselves a college boy here. Thinks he's smarter than us regular folks. One of Jake's friends, a thin man with prison tattoos covering his neck, spoke up. Maybe he thinks he's better than us, Jake. Is that it, David? Jake leaned closer across the table. You think you're better than us? You think you can just walk into our place and look down on us? David felt his patience wearing thin. The stress of deployment, the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life, and now this unprovoked harassment were combining in a dangerous way. Part of him wanted to stand up and show these men exactly what kind of training the Army had given him. But another part, the part that had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, just wanted this to end peacefully. I don't think I'm better than anyone, David said. I just want to finish my drink and leave. See, that's where you're wrong, Jake said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. You don't get to just leave. Not until we're done talking, and we're not done talking. The situation was escalating beyond words now. David could see it in Jake's body language, in the way his friends were positioning themselves, in the aggressive energy that was building in their little group. They were working themselves up to something, and David was the target. He thought about his options. He could try to de-escalate further, but these men didn't seem interested in backing down. He could try to leave, but they were clearly prepared to stop him. He could defend himself if they made the first move, but that would likely result in someone getting seriously hurt. Jake reached into his jacket, and David's muscles tensed automatically. But instead of a weapon, Jake pulled out a bandana and slowly wrapped it around his knuckles. It was a deliberate, threatening gesture designed to show David what was coming. You know what I think, David? Jake said, his voice now loud enough for the entire bar to hear. I think you came into the wrong place tonight. I think maybe you should have stayed in whatever neighborhood you crawled out of. The racial slur that followed was like a match thrown on gasoline. The room went completely silent except for the quiet country music still playing from the jukebox. Everyone was staring now, waiting to see what would happen next. David felt something change inside him. All the stress, all the anger, all the frustration of trying to readjust to a world that didn't seem to understand what he'd sacrificed for it. It all crystallized into a cold, focused energy. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw his skin color and made assumptions. They had no clue about the warrior sitting across from them, but David also knew that violence would solve nothing. It would only prove their prejudices right and make everything worse. So instead of responding with anger, he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He reached slowly into his wallet. David's movement toward his wallet made Jake and his friends tense up immediately. In their world, reaching for a wallet could mean reaching for a weapon, or maybe David was about to try to buy his way out of trouble. Either way, they were ready to react aggressively. "Easy there, college boy," Jake warned, his hand moving closer to his own jacket. "Keep those hands where I can see them." But David's movements were slow and deliberate, clearly non-threatening. His military training had taught him how to handle tense situations, how to project calm even when surrounded by hostility. He pulled out his worn leather wallet and opened it carefully, making sure everyone could see exactly what he was doing. "Before this goes any further," David said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made even Jake pause, "I think there's something you should know." From his wallet, David pulled out a small photograph that looked like it had been handled many times. The edges were soft and worn, and there was a small tear in one corner that had been carefully taped. He placed it gently on the table between himself and Jake, positioning it so the bearded man could see it clearly. Jake looked down at the photo suspiciously, as if it might be some kind of trick. But curiosity got the better of him, and he leaned forward to get a better look. What he saw made his expression change completely. The photograph showed two soldiers in full military combat gear, standing side by side in front of an armored vehicle. The desert landscape behind them was unmistakably Afghanistan. One soldier was David, younger looking but unmistakably him, with the same calm eyes and serious expression. The other soldier was a young white man with a familiar face, someone Jake would have recognized anywhere. "That's me on the left," David said softly. "The other soldier is Corporal Jimmy Patterson. We served 3 tours together in Afghanistan." Jake's face went pale. His hand started to shake as he picked up the photograph to look at it more closely. The aggressive posture he'd maintained just moments before completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like shock. "Jimmy was my battle buddy," David continued, watching Jake's reaction carefully. "In the military, that means we were responsible for each other. We watched each other's backs, shared our gear, covered for each other in firefights. Jimmy saved my life more times than I can count, and I'd like to think I did the same for him." The other men around the table were confused by their leader's sudden change in demeanor. They'd never seen Jake look so shaken, so vulnerable. The thin man with the neck tattoos tried to interrupt. "Jake, what's going on?" "Who cares about some picture?" But Jake wasn't listening to his friends anymore. He was staring at the photograph like it contained answers to questions he'd been asking for months. His tough guy facade was cracking, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "Jimmy talked about his family all the time," David continued, "especially his dad. He said his father had taught him everything important, how to fix engines, how to stand up for what's right, how to be a man. He was proud to be your son, Jake, prouder than you'll ever know." Jake's breathing became labored. The photograph trembled in his hands as memories flooded back. Memories of raising Jimmy, of teaching him to ride motorcycles, of watching him grow from a rebellious teenager into a responsible young man who'd decided to serve his country. David reached into his wallet again and pulled out another item, a small, worn piece of paper. "Jimmy wrote this letter to you about 2 weeks before he died. He never got the chance to send it." The word "died" hit Jake like a physical blow. His son had been killed by an improvised explosive device 6 months ago, and the grief had been eating him alive ever since. He'd buried his pain and anger in alcohol and the camaraderie of his motorcycle club. But here was David, a living connection to his son's final months, sitting right in front of him. "He used to talk about coming home and working in your garage," David said. "He had all these plans about expanding the business, maybe specializing in vintage motorcycles. He said you were the smartest mechanic he'd ever known, and he wanted to learn everything you could teach him." Jake's tough friends were getting increasingly uncomfortable with this display of emotion. They'd never seen their leader show weakness, and they didn't know how to handle it. But David wasn't finished. Jimmy died saving 3 other soldiers from that IED explosion. He saw the device first and pushed them out of the way. The blast got him instead of them. David's voice remained steady, but his eyes showed the pain of losing someone important. Those 3 soldiers are alive today because of your son's courage. The room had gone completely silent except for Jake's labored breathing. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was watching this unexpected scene unfold. The jukebox finished its song, and for a moment there was no sound at all. Jake finally looked up from the photograph, and David could see tears in the older man's eyes. All the hatred and aggression from just minutes before had been replaced by raw grief and confusion. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" Jake whispered. "Why didn't anyone tell me about you?" "Jimmy gave me your address," David explained. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd come find you and tell you how he really felt about you. He was worried that you thought he'd joined the army to get away from home, to reject everything you'd taught him. But that wasn't true. He joined because you'd taught him to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." David pulled out his phone and scrolled through several videos. "He recorded these messages for you during our last deployment. He was planning to send them when we got back to base, but..." David's voice trailed off. "They both knew how that story ended. He wanted you to know that everything good about him came from you," David continued. "His courage, his loyalty, his sense of right and wrong. He said he learned all of that from his father. From you, Jake." Jake was openly crying now, his massive frame shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. His friends didn't know what to do with this version of their leader. The man who'd been ready to start a fight over racial prejudice was falling apart over memories of his dead son. David reached across the table and gently touched Jake's shoulder. "Jimmy loved you, Jake. He was proud to be your son, and he died protecting other people's sons. That's the kind of man you raised." The photograph lay on the table between them, a bridge connecting 2 men who moments before had been ready to hurt each other. Now they were united by grief, by loss, and by love for the same brave young soldier who would never come home. Jake looked up at David through his tears, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a threat or an outsider, but as the last person to share his son's final months. The man who'd been there when Jake couldn't be, the brother in arms who'd watched over Jimmy when his father was thousands of miles away. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry." David nodded, understanding that the apology went far deeper than just tonight's confrontation. It was an apology for months of misdirected anger, for pain that had turned into hatred, for almost dishonoring his son's memory by attacking the very person Jimmy had considered family. The revelation had changed everything. 2 men who'd been strangers minutes before now shared the most important thing in both their lives: love for a fallen soldier who'd connected them across the divide of race and circumstance. Jake's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he held the photograph. The image of his son alive and smiling in that faraway desert was almost too much to bear. For 6 months he'd been living with nothing but the memory of Jimmy's flag-draped coffin and the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood at the funeral. Now here was proof that Jimmy had been happy, that he'd found brotherhood, that his final months hadn't been filled with loneliness and fear. "Tell me about him," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the quiet country music still playing in the background. "Tell me what he was really like over there." David glanced around the bar. Jake's biker friends were still standing nearby, but their aggressive posture had completely changed. They looked confused and uncomfortable, unsure how to react to seeing their tough leader broken down in tears. The other bar patrons were giving them space, sensing that something profound was happening. "Jimmy was the kind of soldier everyone wanted on their team," David began, his voice gentle but clear. "He never complained, no matter how hard things got. When we were on patrol for 18 hours straight in 120-degree heat, Jimmy would be the one cracking jokes to keep everyone's spirits up." Jake leaned forward, hanging on every word. This was what he'd been desperate for since the military chaplain had knocked on his door 6 months ago. Real information about his son's final months. Stories that went beyond the official reports and formal condolences. "He carried a picture of you in his helmet." David continued, pulling out his phone to show Jake a video. "Look, he recorded this after a particularly rough mission. We'd been in a firefight that lasted 6 hours and Jimmy was exhausted, but he still wanted to send you a message." David turned the phone so Jake could see the screen. The video showed Jimmy in his combat gear, sitting against a concrete wall in what looked like a military compound. He was dirty and tired, but his eyes lit up when he started talking. "Hey, Dad." Jimmy's voice came through the phone speaker, and Jake gasped at hearing his son's voice again. "Just finished another patrol, and I wanted you to know I'm okay. David here has been taking good care of me, just like I know you would if you were here." Jake watched, transfixed, as his son continued talking on the tiny screen. "I know you worry about me being over here, but I want you to know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. You taught me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, and that's what we're doing here. I'm proud to be your son, and I hope I'm making you proud too." The video ended and Jake stared at the blank screen for a long moment. "He made more of those," David said quietly. "Dozens of them. He was always planning to send them to you when we got back to base, but—" David didn't need to finish the sentence. "Why didn't I know about you?" Jake asked, looking up at David with confusion and pain in his eyes. "Why didn't the Army tell me Jimmy had a best friend? Why didn't anyone mention you at the funeral?" David sighed. "Military bureaucracy doesn't really account for personal relationships. When a soldier dies, the official notifications go to immediate family. Battle buddies, friends, the people who are actually closest to them. We often get left out of the process. I tried to contact you through official channels, but it took months to get your address. By the time I got leave to come find you, I wasn't even sure you'd want to hear from me." Jake shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes, but this time, the anger was directed at the system that had kept him from learning about David, not at David himself. "Of course I'd want to hear from you. You're the last person who really knew my son. You were with him when I couldn't be." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Jimmy kept a journal. He wrote in it every day, mostly letters to you that he never sent. The military gave me his personal effects to bring back to his family. I've been carrying this for 6 months, waiting for the right time to give it to you. Jake's eyes widened as David handed him the notebook. The cover was worn and stained, clearly carried through multiple deployments. Jake opened it carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands. The first page was dated almost 2 years ago, and it started with "Dear Dad. He wrote to you every single day," David explained. "When he was scared, when he was proud, when he missed home, when something reminded him of you. It's all in there. The real Jimmy, the son you raised thinking about his father thousands of miles away." Jake tried to read the first entry, but tears were blurring his vision. The familiar handwriting, the casual tone, the obvious love and respect in every word. It was like having Jimmy back for just a moment. David continued sharing memories while Jake composed himself. "Jimmy used to say that everything he knew about being a good man he learned from you. He talked about how you taught him to fix things with his hands, how you showed him that real strength comes from protecting others, not hurting them. I wasn't always the best father," Jake admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I was tough on him growing up. Maybe too tough. I wanted him to be strong, to be able to handle whatever life threw at him. He knew that," David assured him. "He understood that you were preparing him for the world. And it worked, Jake. Jimmy was the strongest, most reliable soldier I ever served with. When things got bad, really bad, everyone looked to Jimmy because they knew he wouldn't break. That strength came from you." Jake's friends were still hovering nearby, but they seemed to understand that something bigger than their usual bar confrontations was happening. The thin man with the neck tattoos, who'd been ready to fight alongside Jake just minutes earlier, was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the emotional scene playing out in front of him. "Jimmy saved my life on our second deployment," David continued. "We were clearing a building in Kandahar when insurgents opened fire from the roof. Jimmy saw the muzzle flash before I did and tackled me out of the way. The bullets hit the wall right where my head had been." Jake looked up from the journal, his eyes intense. "He never told me about that in his letters home. He never told you about any of the dangerous stuff. He didn't want you to worry, but he told me all about it afterward. He said his dad had taught him to watch out for his family, and that included his Army family. He said you'd be disappointed in him if he let something happen to someone he could have protected. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that his son had been protecting others using principles Jake had taught him, was almost overwhelming. Jake had spent months wondering if Jimmy's death had been meaningless, if his son had died for nothing in a war that seemed to go on forever. Now he was learning that Jimmy had not only died protecting others, but had spent his entire deployment living by the values his father had instilled in him. "There's something else," David said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Jimmy was working on this when he died. He never finished it." David handed Jake a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in Jimmy's handwriting, addressed to Dad. The letter was unfinished, ending mid-sentence, but there was enough to break Jake's heart all over again. "Dad, I know I don't say this enough, but I love you and I'm grateful for everything you taught me. Being over here has shown me what real courage looks like. And I realize now that you had that courage all along. You raised me by yourself after Mom died, and you never once made me feel like I was a burden." The letter continued for several paragraphs, describing Jimmy's pride in his father, his gratitude for the lessons he'd learned, and his plans for their future together when he came home, plans that would never happen now. Jake folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. The son he'd raised, the boy he'd worried about, the young man he'd been so proud of, Jimmy had become exactly the kind of person Jake had hoped he would be. And David, this stranger who'd become his son's closest friend, had been the witness to that transformation. What happened next stunned everyone in Murphy's Tavern. Jake Patterson, the intimidating leader of the Iron Wolves who had been ready to start a fight just 30 minutes earlier, stood up from his chair and walked around the table to where David was sitting. Without saying a word, he pulled David into a fierce embrace. The sight of these two men, one white, one black, one a grizzled biker, one a young soldier, holding each other and crying openly in the middle of a country bar, was something none of the witnesses would ever forget. It was raw human emotion stripped of all the barriers that usually keep people apart. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered into David's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for the things I said. Jimmy would be ashamed of me." David hugged him back just as tightly. No, he wouldn't. He'd understand. Grief makes us do things we never thought we'd do. He'd just be happy that we found each other. Jake's biker friends stood frozen, not knowing how to process what they were seeing. Their leader, the man they'd followed into countless bar fights and confrontations, was apologizing to someone they'd been ready to hurt just moments before. The thin man with neck tattoos looked around nervously, as if he was expecting this to be some kind of trick. But Tom the bartender understood what was happening. He'd seen enough of life to recognize a moment of genuine human connection when it occurred. He quietly told the other patrons to give the two men some space, and gradually the normal sounds of the bar resumed around them. Jake finally stepped back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've been so angry since Jimmy died. Angry at the army, angry at the government, angry at the world. I didn't know where to put all that pain, so I took it out on anyone who was different from me." David nodded with understanding. "I've seen it before. Losing someone in combat, it changes you. It makes you want to blame anyone for the unfairness of it all." "But that's not what Jimmy would have wanted," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "He didn't die so I could hate people. He died protecting people." He looked around at his friends who were still watching with confusion. All people. Jake turned to address his biker companions directly. "Boys, I need you to hear this. This man David was my son's best friend. He watched over Jimmy when I couldn't. He was there for my boy in ways I never could be." His voice carried the authority they were used to hearing from him, but now it was backed by something deeper than just dominance. "Jimmy died saving 3 soldiers," Jake continued. 3 American soldiers who went home to their families because my son sacrificed his life for them. And you know what? I bet those 3 soldiers weren't all white. I bet Jimmy didn't ask about their race or their religion or where they came from before he pushed them out of the way of that bomb." The thin man shifted uncomfortably. "Jake, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we've been wrong, Tommy. All this anger, all this hate, it's not what Jimmy stood for. It's not what America stands for. And it sure as hell isn't what his sacrifice was about." Jake's voice was getting stronger, more confident. Jimmy fought alongside soldiers of every color, every background, every religion. They were his brothers. David here is his brother. David pulled out his phone again and showed Jake more photos from their deployment, pictures of their unit. A diverse group of young Americans from all walks of life, all united in their mission. White soldiers, black soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, soldiers whose families had come from dozens of different countries, all wearing the same uniform, all fighting for the same flag. "This is what Jimmy's army looked like," David explained. "This is who he served with, who he protected, who protected him. We didn't see color over there. We saw soldiers, Americans, people worth fighting for. Jake studied each photo carefully, seeing his son's face among this diverse group of warriors. In every picture, Jimmy was smiling, clearly at home with these people who looked nothing like the folks he'd grown up with in rural Tennessee. I want to hear more about them, Jake said. I want to know about every person Jimmy served with. For the next 2 hours, David shared story after story. He told Jake about Rodriguez, the medic from Texas who'd saved dozens of lives. About Washington, the communications specialist from Detroit who'd kept them connected to base during firefights. About Kowalski, the engineer from Chicago who'd cleared countless roadside bombs. He told Jake about the time Jimmy had shared his care package with a soldier whose family couldn't afford to send anything. About how Jimmy had volunteered for extra patrols to give married soldiers more time to video chat with their families. About how Jimmy had learned basic Arabic phrases so he could communicate better with local civilians who were trying to help them. With each story, Jake's understanding of his son's service grew deeper and more complex. This wasn't just about patriotism or duty. It was about Jimmy, living out the values of compassion and protection that Jake had tried to instill in him as a child. Jake's friends gradually drifted away as the evening wore on. Some of them left the bar entirely, uncomfortable with this new version of their leader. Others stayed but kept their distance, not sure how to process what they'd witnessed. Tommy, the thin man with neck tattoos, lingered the longest, occasionally catching fragments of David's stories about Jimmy. Jake, Tommy finally said, approaching the table hesitantly. I'm gonna head out. You okay? Jake looked up at his longtime friend. I'm better than I've been in months, Tommy. For the first time since Jimmy died, I feel like I understand what his life meant. Tommy nodded awkwardly and started to leave, then turned back. That stuff David was saying about Jimmy saving those other soldiers, that's really how it happened? That's really how it happened, David confirmed. Your friend's son died a hero's death saving American lives. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then nodded again and left without another word. Jake watched him go, understanding that this revelation would create ripples far beyond tonight's encounter. As the bar grew quieter, David and Jake continued talking. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet again. Jake wanted to visit Jimmy's grave with David, to have someone there who'd really known his son during his final months. David wanted to see the garage where Jimmy had learned to work with his hands, to understand more about the foundation that had shaped his best friend. I need to ask you something, Jake said as the evening wound down. Will you come to the Iron Wolves' next meeting? I want the whole club to hear Jimmy's story. I want them to understand what we almost did here tonight. David agreed, understanding the significance of what Jake was asking. It wouldn't be easy for either of them, but it was what Jimmy would have wanted. His father and his best friend working together to build bridges instead of walls. As they prepared to leave, Jake pulled David aside one final time. Jimmy's room at home, I haven't touched anything since he died. His mother's been gone for 10 years, so it's just been me rattling around in that old house with all his stuff exactly like he left it. Would you help me go through it? Help me understand what mattered to him? David clasped Jake's shoulder. I'd be honored. They walked out of Murphy's Tavern together. Two men who'd entered as strangers and enemies but were leaving as something approaching family. The story of what happened that night would spread throughout the small town and beyond, becoming a powerful reminder that even the deepest divisions can be bridged by shared love and loss. Behind them, Tom the bartender cleaned up their table, shaking his head in amazement at what he'd witnessed. In 30 years of serving drinks and watching human drama play out in his establishment, he'd never seen anything quite like the transformation that had occurred between those two men. The photograph of Jimmy and David remained on the table for a moment before David carefully tucked it back into his wallet. But the connection it had revealed, between father and battle buddy, between grief and healing, between prejudice and understanding, would last much longer than one evening in a Tennessee bar.